Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scully McLean and I am the Regional Agriculture Land Care Facilitator for the Limestone Coast Landscape Board. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our fifth and final webinar in the Healthy Soils series. I would like to acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of the ancestral lands of the Limestone Coast region. Potowich to the north, Jarawajali to the east, Buandik to the south, and Miantung to the west. We acknowledge elders past and present and respect the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of Aboriginal people to country. So, this afternoon, I would like to welcome back Dr Mel Fraser. She is a Senior Consultant for the Primary Industries and Region South Australia. Those of you who have joined us previously in our webinar series would know that Mel's interest in soils began in her late teens. After travelling and studying in Australia and Canada, Mel had the opportunity to really sink her teeth into soils by completing her PhD in the Limestone Coast, investigating the saline and sodic clay soils of the Avenue Plains. After completing her PhD, Mel moved to the Northern Territory to work, and in 2014, she received an opportunity to relocate to Narracoorte and take up a position working from the Stewart PIRSA office. Mel has now put down her roots and calls the Limestone Coast home. Out of the many accomplishments that Mel has made, her proudest moments here have been completing the Limestone Coast Leadership Program in 2019, the birth of her second son, and being one of only 2 people from PIRSA to meet the future King of England in the Barossa Valley in 2015, where she also rubbed shoulders with the Queen of the Barossa, Maggie Veer. Mel's local knowledge and experience in soils puts her in high demand, and I feel very lucky to have Mel here today to take us on a journey to learn about improving productivity on clay soils.
Thank you so much, Skyly, for another kind and generous introduction to me. For those of you who don't believe my tales, this is a picture of Prince Charles when he and his wife visited Australia at the end of 2015. This is the back of my head at the time, and you can see he was very engrossed and excited about the incorporation of organic amendments actually into soils to improve soil fertility. Prince Charles is an avid believer in organic farming, and I think he was quite pleased to hear all about it. So I'm quite pleased to share my message, not just with you folk, but with the future King of England as well. But you're right, Scully, I was most excited about meeting Maggie Veer. I am here today to talk to you in our final webinar on improving productivity on clay soils. Scully and I were saying before, we're both a bit nervous today. I think for me, we've had such great feedback from the other 4 webinars that you've joined us for, and I'm a bit scared of stumbling at the last hurdle. So in the spirit of the recent Olympics though, it really was a bit of a team effort. So if I stumble, Scully, pick me up and help me along.
Yep.
Hopefully we'll get through the next hour without any grazed knees. So just I'm conscious that we've got a couple of people who've joined us today who we haven't seen online live before. You may have already watched the other webinars, or you may not have, and you may be planning to go back to them. I will repeat a few bits today from the content from the other sessions, but there's other bits that I'll refer you back to if I don't cover it all. And if you see me looking over to the side, that's because my screen is over there and where I can see all my notes and things. So forgive me if I'm not looking directly at the camera. But essentially, I thought we'd just go back again to session 2, webinar 2, where we sort of talked about what makes a soil fertile. And we discussed the concepts of soil structure and stability and porosity and how important they were for providing the architecture for roots and for microbes, you know, really the house for microbes to live in and be protected by, and for water and air movement through soils as well, which is so important for plant growth. We talked about soils, you know, being able to supply and retain nutrients and how important that was. We talked about pH and how if we get to extremes of alkaline or acidic, it can, you know, tie up nutrients and impact on things like, you know, microbial activity in soils. a fertile soil has no toxic elements. It also provides the nutrients sufficient to meet the purpose of what you're using the soil for. So if you're using it for cropping versus for growing pastures versus for maybe raising chooks, you know, the nutrients that you need in the soil to produce each of those either direct plant or animal products is going to vary. So it's important that your soil is fit for purpose. We'll talk about that in a sec. It also harbours and encourages active and diverse microbial communities and has the presence of ecosystem engineers. And so we know, unfortunately, that there are lots of challenges and constraints that can occur in soils, which can impact on all of these different aspects of fertility. We've already discussed some of those in context to sandy soils, but today I'm here to talk to you about their relevance with some of the clay soils that we have across the Limestone Coast. So why clay? Well, you remember from last time that we had about 45% of the region is characterised by sandy soils, and nearly 40% of the region is actually characterised by these next three soil types. So that's our Group B soils, our shallow soils on calcrete and limestone. And really all of these soils exist on the western side of the Narracourt range. So if you're driving down the highway, say between Narracourt and Bull Lagoon, you'll know you've got a range up on the hill behind you. So remember back to Claire's session back in webinar 1, we talked about the evolution of the Limestone Coast and that Narracourt range being about 800,000 to 1 million years old. And then everything as we head to the west across the plains over to the coast to our current day coastline gets younger as we go. And so really what we're talking about here, these Group B soils, they really do occur sort of from this Narracourt range, which is actually where I'm located today, heading to the west of here to the coast. Behind the range here to the east, we have these sort of different duplex type soils, they're Group F soils. So these are loamy textured, you know, on the surface. Sometimes they can be quite silty, they can set very hard, and overlying very clay rich B horizons. And then we have a group of cracking clays up around Watertown and also around Avenue and down towards Ferner as well. So those two clay types are minor. But they're still significant from an agricultural perspective and particularly from a cropping perspective as well. Now, of these Group B soils, a lot of these soils in the northern part of the catchment or the Limestone Coast are actually can be shallow loams or sands straight over limestone. So the ones that I'm particularly going to talk about today are captured in this map. So this is all of the actual clay soils. Commonly, they're characterised or identified as the alkaline clay soils. And that's what I'll be focusing on in terms of clay types today. This is what they look like. I was originally just going to focus on the Group Bs because it's a bit easier because they're all typically alkaline, but as I mentioned, the Group F and the Group E soils are also important, particularly for cropping in our region. And so they are soils that historically receive a lot of inputs, but they also have a lot of outputs as well. So it's important that we are really aware of the kinds of constraints that those soils can possess, either naturally or induced, and then how we might go about identifying them and then treating them to maintain their productive capacity without, you know, having any negative impact on the environment or our ecosystems. So as you can see, the Group B soils, you know, they look beautiful from the surface. I'm sure you all know them as, you know, chocolatey black soils that shrink and swell commonly and look amazing. They're the ones that really gave the the government back in the mid 1800s a bit of a bum steer because they came down here. A couple of surveyors came down to the southeast in the summertime and saw these big, wide, vast plains of black cracking soils, and reported back to the governor that they'd found the most amazing place for agricultural production in the state. And so the governor then authorised them to go back and survey a postal route from Wellington to Portland. And they came back in July and they had to unhook their horses and actually swim them across the plains because there was so much water on the surface that, you know, these vast tracts of agricultural land were actually underwater. So, you know, they are amazing soils, but they are absolutely with their challenges and certainly with their opportunities. As I mentioned, the Group F soils, these sort of duplex soils of sands and loams and silts overlying clay soils. These are really common, like I said, sort of behind, sort of if you're thinking Apsley, Edenhope, Francis through that patch. And then as we head to the north up around Watertown, we can get these cracking clay soils, which aren't related to the Group B soils. So the key characteristics of these, down on the plains, really we're talking about clays that have got sometimes varying fertility. There are some different clay minerals that are present. We've got some kaolinites, which are more of the grey clays that actually don't shrink and swell. So when those soils set very hard, they are not very good at repairing themselves. Where the really black cracking stuff, you can kind of get that a bit boggy and it will actually recover when it dries out. So there are some different sort of clay types on the plains to be aware of, because that does impact on the way that they respond to things like salinity and acidicity, which we'll talk about a bit later. They do have a high water holding capacity, but unfortunately these soils are commonly very shallow. So as you can see in the photograph here, we've only got about 20 centimetres of soil that we can rely on for really growing plants in. So below that, the roots have got to work pretty hard to get below that rock. And often there's a cap at the surface of that rock as well, which can be a completely physical limiting barrier to any kind of root exploration. Later in the season, even though we know we've got a shallow water table, we're not able to access it because essentially the door's been closed. So they look great from the surface, but you dig a hole and you soon know all about them. These soils commonly have a high organic carbon, and it is related to their position in the landscape. So the fact that they're down on the plains in between the dunes, they naturally stay very wet, and they have the capacity to produce a lot of biomass, which doesn't break down because the environment is so wet. They often have a high pH, they're alkaline, and they're naturally saline in a lot of cases, and certainly historically they would have been, with surface waters and also groundwaters, travelling through the region historically. Certainly a big salt load and input into these soils every year, and a big flushing event as well, with fresh waters that would travel from the south up to the north across those plains historically. So again, a few challenges, and they can be sodic too. So again, we'll talk about that. And of course now this inundation, which historically was annual, and now of course we know it's not quite as frequent. We have over 2,700 kilometres of official drainage. I think it's a bit more than that now actually, of official drainage network right through the Limestone Coast, and of course that has brought those water tables down, and of course we've seen a shift in the distribution and the intensity of rainfall, which has also helped to lower groundwaters. So perhaps not as regular, but still an issue in some years to deal with. When we have a look at these soils, this particular soil is actually from just out the back of Francis. These type of clay soils can commonly be, again, quite rich in clay, lower fertility than the ones down on the plains, but you can see that they're deeper, so we don't have those rock lenses commonly in them. But they can have lower organic carbon throughout the profile, and that means they're not quite as friable because the clay is quite dense, and so it can be really hard for these soils from a perspective of aeration and water infiltration. These soils will really waterlog. So where we talked about inundation before, which is really caused by the rise of the groundwater table coming to the surface, or surface flowing waters, in these types of clays, the waterlogging is actually caused by slow infiltration or percolation of water down through our profiles. And so that water gets held up and these soils can get quite boggy. These particular soils can be either neutraline or alkaline or acidic, particularly like the red clays up around Bordertown towards out at Pine Hill near Wolseley can be quite acidic. And like I said, they have a moderate water holding capacity. We commonly find, crop roots down to about 60 to 70 centimetres in these soils, so we can get our roots down pretty deep. They can be sodic in the subsurface layers though, which again, enhances this sort of poor drainage and exploration of roots. And certainly under irrigation, these soils have the capacity to build up with salt and become quite saline. Here's another example. This soil is actually from Pine Hill. And you will see on the surface, again, another really, soil that looks great from the surface, but you've only got to get down to 40 centimetres and you find this really dense alkaline clay, which is really acting as a deterrent, both from a toxic perspective and also a physical perspective of stopping roots from going any further. So you can see how dry the soil and the surface is there. The wheat crop that was growing has extracted most of the moisture from the surface, and now it's trying to get down deeper. But of course, there are these physical constraints. And of course, we know that the fertility of the soil is really determined by its chemical and its physical and its biological properties and how well they function together. So if you get one part of the system being let down, it can really compromise the others. And of course, it's the combination of these constraints in these different clay types across the limestone coast that can lead to their poor plant water use, and also, you know, troubles with either wind or water erosion, things like nutrient loss as well. So, you know, as our soils become waterlogged, we can lose nitrogen, for example, either as nitrates in the groundwater or as gases as nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of, really, and the way that we're farming them to make sure that we're not causing degradation either our own farm or in our environment. So I introduced the concept of a soil being fit for purpose back in webinar 2, and we discussed it in webinar 4 as well. And this is an example of a crop out at Bull Lagoon last year, looking amazing. We had a really kind spring and a good finish out there. But we know that the roots here are limited by shallow rock. And so again, you know, if we've got all of the great environmental conditions all in our favour, you know, we can produce some amazing things, but it doesn't take much for a system to fall over and to not function at its optimum. So the question I want you to all ask is your soil fit for purpose? You know, what are you expecting it to do for you? And is it performing? And is it functioning to its full potential? And if it's not, then what can you do about it? And I guess that's what I'm here today to talk about. So again, we're going to run through a hypothetical scenario, same as we did last time. You know, what would I do if I came across a problem paddock? So in this case, I've got a paddock here that I've selected. It's one that I've used in a number of different case studies, and I'll show some data from it today. And the hypothetical scenario I've got here, some of it is true, but certainly I haven't seen the wind erosion from this particular paddock, but this is one that has been sent to me from the Landscape Board, captured in the Limestone Coast, but at a different site. But essentially in a paddock like this, what we commonly see, even from the aerial photography that we see, which is just out of Google Earth, you know, always go and have a look at Google Earth at the recent photos, but also go back through the time series as well and see what you can see and how things have changed over time. It's a really handy little tool. You know, in a paddock like this, what we observe is sort of patchy growth, you know, areas that'll hold on for longer and areas that'll die off. You know, some really poor drainage in places. We know that we can struggle to grow things like beans and canola. They'll just look yellow and sad for months on end until the sun comes out, and then they, you know, they finally get away. But we're starting to see grain yield variability, and particularly, you know, areas that look poor through the season actually, you know, have a yield penalty as well, particularly in a dry finish. And in some cases, they appears to be getting worse. So this is the paddock that we're going to work with. And the first place that I always start is from space. So again, if you haven't watched webinar 4, I encourage you to head over and do that, where I talk about this just internet-based web platform called IRISat. It's where I go for all of my satellite-derived imagery. It's a free application. But essentially, if we have a look at an image like this, this is from December in 2017, when this particular paddock was sown to chickpeas. And what we can see here are these areas of, you know, distinct blue, which means there's a high amount of above ground green photosynthesizing biomass at the time in December. And then we've got these areas, we go into green, which is lower, and then yellow, which is lower again. And then we've actually got a couple of patches of no above ground active green biomass. So we're seeing this real strong variability in terms of a crop which is really senesced already and finished versus one which is still completely growing. Now you can imagine the kind of challenge that this creates for the farmer who really wants to get the header in the paddock, you know, before Christmas Day. And, you know, half of it's ready to go and half of it's not. So, you know, we want to try to understand and get to the bottom of what is causing this kind of variability and what can I do about it. So the next place that I would go after that, particularly if it's been cropped, is actually back to the office to have a look at any yield maps. So the yield map that came off that paddock after Christmas and New Year was actually is this image you can see here in front. So here we see this green band of high yields are up to 1.9 tonnes of chickpeas here. We've got a yield penalty of over a tonne, you know, a tonne and a half back to these red zones. So, you know, we're at, you know, only 400 kilos of chickpeas in these red zones and up to 1.9 tonnes down here in the green. And you can see here's the satellite image. This is just the NDVI as well. So you can see these patches of really strong growth and the rest which has senesced. And you can see the impact in this case, you know, 1.5 tonnes of chickpeas to the hectare. So we know it's costing money, and so potentially then that justifies us actually spending some money to rectify the problem. So the next thing we do is zone it up to try and work out what has been going on. In this particular case, I've selected 2 distinct zones. And now we're going to move on to diagnosis. So as I discussed, we've got a range of different constraints in these clay soils in different parts of our landscape across the limestone coast, and predominantly that's changes in the texture. Also, the depth of that A horizon, either above a B horizon of thick, dense clay or rock. Issues with pH and extremes there, the expression of salinity, the development of sedicity, nutrient constraints, and then also issues with waterlogging and inundation. So I'm going to talk through now how to diagnose each of those, and then we'll move on to how we might go about treating them. So I mentioned back in webinar 2 about soil textures being about the relative proportions of sand and silt and clay, and the impact that soil texture can have on things like water infiltration and root growth and inherent nutrient fertility. And I mentioned before about mineralogy. So in terms of the actual clay that's there, how fertile that's going to be, how naturally fertile that's going to be. And those two things obviously can impact how fertile the topsoil is and what you can do with it and the kind of issues that are expressed. And then, depth to rock or depth to clay is also really important in terms of knowing how big your bucket is. How far can our roots, easily explore to extract water for the crop that you're trying to grow. And so knowing those things across different zones is really important. And because rarely are any of these measures actually uniform. So it's a great place to start when you do see that kind of yield variability like we saw in that last slide. So when it comes to diagnosing soil type and depth and presence of subsoil or subsurface horizons which might be stopping root growth, really you need to dig a hole, and in most cases an excavator is required. There's a lot of things you can do with a backhoe if you've got one, or a front end loader, but really if you have got rock lenses, then a small excavator is enough usually to poke through those and give you a really good idea of what's happening below the surface. And the things you want to look for when you do open up a pit is, how deep are the surface layers, and you can do a hand texture of those. So if you head over to the soil quality website, you'll find some really great information about how to do a hand texturing and working out the percentage of sand, silt and clay and what that might mean. And then, where do rocks come in? Are they hard rocks? Is it gravelly rocks? Are there compacted layers? How deep is it until you hit a horizon boundary? How does the colour change? Because colour often will tell you really where the biological activity in the roots have been growing, and we'll commonly see the A1 horizon, which is 10 to 15 centimetres deep, which is a really dark colour, and then underneath that you'll get this kind of bleached layer. There's not a whole lot going on, not a lot of roots there, can be quite compacted, and then we'll hit these sort of deeper clay layers below that. So you can really see a lot of the kind of activity or the life in soil just by looking at the change in colour. And also moisture, where has the water got to? This particular soil pit, when we dug this back in 2017, the paddock had been, it's a paddock from near Francis, and so it was a really wet spring. And the farmer said, I don't think you'll be able to get an excavator in there, Mel, you're going to get bogged, because there was water on the surface of the soil. And we pulled an excavator in there and we got along fine, and we dug a hole. And what we actually found was that the soil was saturated for the first 15 to 20 centimetres, and below that it was dry. And that's one of these common problems with sedicity that can occur with these subsurface layers, is that they just won't let water in, and so all this water sitting in the top. So water is a really great indicator of where moisture in the soil is a really great indicator of where water is infiltrating to when it does rain, but then also where the crops are going and where they might have extracted moisture from as well at any given time. So it's really useful to do these kind of measurements, through a season to see, what water's left in the profile at the end of the season too, can tell you a lot about where the crops have stopped or plants have stopped accessing moisture. One of the things I've been doing recently as well is just using these grids. This is just a piece of sheet mesh, stood up in a pit and cut to about 1 metre. And it's really great for actually using a visual score type, completely subjective kind of assessment, but it lets you really, quantify what you can see in each of those grids. And you can actually assign a number from 1 to 5, depending on the number of roots that I see. And it just helps you sort of draw that picture, particularly if you've got a good spot and a bad spot. So say zone 1 and zone 2 in this particular paddock, that you can have a look at where the roots are growing and, and identify some of those different characteristics as well about where the colour changes and where the rocks pop up and things. So, it doesn't cost you anything, to do that. And if you've got an excavator, I guess, but you know, it's a really great little tool. And the other thing you can do, which is really handy, I found in some soil types, is electromagnetic induction sensing. And so this is actually an EM38. It's a Geonics EM38 is the manufacturer of this particular model. And essentially this it's not an implement or a machine, technology is towed behind either a ute or a quad bike on the surface of the soil. It sends an electromagnetic pulse through the soil at one end, and it's collected at the other, and that tells us about the characteristics in relation to clay type, moisture and salt, basically, through the profile, and we can create different depth maps. So this is actually an electromagnetic induction sensing map from that particular paddock. And you might think, oh, gee, I've seen that picture before, but actually you haven't. What you've seen before is things like this NDVI image and also the grain yield map. And so what we see in this particular case is this wonderful relationship in terms of electromagnetic induction. So you can see here that this is actually low conductance areas in the red, and these areas here in the blue have got high conductivity. So you can see that in this particular case, this kind of mapping technology, it only costs about $15 to $20 a hectare to get it done. I absolutely recommend it as a base layer for your farms. And you know, sometimes it can really relate perfectly to what you're seeing above ground, which is excellent. So if we have a look in this particular case at soil pits that are dug in zones 1 and zones 2, this is actually what we found. So in zone 1, you can see, and apologies, these aren't great photos, but we can see here that we've got lots of rock and rubble right through the profile that sort of pops up from, you know, 15 to 20 centimetres, and lots of rock and rubble underneath. And here in zone 2, we've actually got 40 to 50 centimetres of black soil before we hit this rock and rubble lower in the profile. So we can see here that our effective rooting zone is really only 15 to 20 centimetres before we hit hard rock. And here we've actually got a bit bigger bucket, and essentially that's the main thing that is leading to this difference in productivity in this particular year and a dry finish, when we're really, you know, it's December, so we're really relying a lot on stored soil moisture at that point to get the crop finished. So the next constraint I want to talk about is pH. And I introduced pH in webinar 2, and we talked about particularly acidity in webinar 4. But as a reminder, you know, pH is a measure of either the hydrogen or the hydroxyl ions in a soil water solution. And really the pH can influence both the activity of microbes and the availability of nutrients, and can bring things into toxic, into the toxic range as well. And what we find here is that in our alkaline soil, so like the ones down on the plains, that we see, you know, microbial activity drop off once the pH gets above 9. We see things like, you know, nitrogen and particularly phosphorus, once the pH gets above 8.2, start to reduce in their availability, either in their availability or they have a higher capacity to get tied up with things like calcium. Phosphorus will get tied up with calcium at these high pH, and it won't be available to the plant. And then you've got other elements like boron, which can actually come into concentration and then be toxic to plants as well. So it's really important to know what your pH is doing at both ends of the scale, because of course we see these similar sorts of trends as the pH drops too low as well. So what we find is that those clay soils on the plains are usually naturally alkaline. The red clays are often acidic, and that B horizon clay, like I showed you at the beginning, can either be neutral or alkaline or acidic. So it's really important, particularly if you're going to go clay spreading and digging up those deeper deposits. It's really important that you know what you are digging up so that you can avoid any potential, you know, negative consequences. We diagnose pH. Well, again, I showed you this back in webinar 4. If you see, we used one of these soil test kits before. So just the liquid indicator dye, puff the powder onto a soil sample, let it develop for a minute, and then use the colour card to identify the pH that has developed. And so here's an example from soils from zone 1 and zone 2. So we can see we've got these sort of deeper, darker purple colours here. So we've got a pH of about 8.5. But in zone 2, we've actually got some green. And so when you've got green and purple, that's when I call it about neutral. So 7 to 7.5 is really common when you actually get both of those colours. So again, you know, go and collect these soil samples by the zone. So the first thing always, you know, zone up your soils or your paddocks. you know, take a shovel, some trays or some bowls, one of these test kits, and you can answer a lot of questions really quickly. Yeah, and then there's some sort of severity ratings that you can assign, you know, dependent on the pH. At the lab, obviously, if you do find that you've got some of these extreme kind of colours, either really, really bright yellows and greens or really deep purples, I absolutely recommend that you send a soil test to the lab and just get that confirmed. And they'll measure the pH both in water and in calcium chloride. If your soils are acidic, then also request the aluminium test as well, texture and the organic carbon, and that's really important for making a lime rate recommendation. And if it's really alkaline, I would get the phosphorus buffering index measured too, and also I would look at salts in the profile as well, because they're often related. Of course, consider the best steps to sample. So look at your particular soil profile and sample accordingly for where you see things like roots, worms, rocks, compacted layers, and bulk those samples up and send to the lab. The other thing you can do, of course, is map the pH, and so we've got these on-the-go type soil pH mappers now. Again, $15 to $20 a hectare. You can get a lot of information really quickly about the degree of variability that you've got in a paddock, and that can help you make great decisions around, you know, in this case, you know, like a variable rate lime application, or gypsum is the other one for acidity, which I'll show you an example of later on. The next constraint I wanted to talk about is salinity. So salinity is caused by a high concentration of dissolved salts, essentially. And we know that in this environment that salinity is driven by sodium chloride. And like I mentioned at the start, you know, most of this in this environment is natural and related to both our proximity, our close proximity to the coast. So we always get salts being driven in by wind and rainfall, and from the coastline, but also from our undulating or fluctuating is the word I'm looking for, fluctuating groundwater levels, which are naturally saline as well. So we know that we can get a lot of salt actually deposited in our landscape, and depending on how much rainfall we get and how effective the drainage systems are, impacts on our net removal of salts from our landscape, if you like. We know that salinity has a negative impact primarily on plant growth, and there's an example of that here where you can see in this first photo with low EC, we've got chicory and lucerne, and then we see the lucerne start to drop out. We've got predominantly chicory, and then we get to a high EC. You can see this crusting on the surface here, and you know, we've got this bare surface cover, or no surface cover, leaving bare soils as the EC is high. So we know that it has, salinity has a toxic impact on plants. It impacts their ability to absorb water from the soil. But we also know that elevated sodium, as part of that sodium chloride, can have an influence on soil structure, which again, I'll talk about in a minute. The diagnosing salinity is pretty straightforward, actually. You can pick up one of these meters online, usually for $300 or $400. They usually come with a dual function, so they'll measure pH and EC, sometimes dissolved solids, temperature, and they're a really handy little kit to have, particularly if you have got some of these clay soils that are expressing constraints. It's one of these is really handy to have in your toolkit, I think, for diagnosing them on farm, so you know where to go. But essentially, you know, a 1 to 5 soil water solution, same as a pH test. So 100 grams of soil to 500 mils of water in a jar, mixed up. Give it a really good shake. You know, come back half an hour later, give it another shake, make sure you've got everything dissolved, and using demineralized or rainwater. And yeah, one of these meters, and you can pretty quickly work out whether you have got a salinity issue, which might be at play if you are worried about productivity on your farm. Obviously, at the lab, we would send this off and they would do the same test, but they'd also look at the soil texture as well, so to provide some recommendations back about how saline the soil is and what impact that's going to have on different plant types. But here is some information on interpreting soil EC values in terms of how severe it is and the effect it would have on plant growth based on the amount of clay that's in the soil. So again, I said the texture is important here. So this kind of information can be provided usually by the lab that analyses your results. The next constraint or area of soil fertility that I want to talk about is actually acidity, but I thought before we jump into that, perhaps we'll just have a refresher on the cation exchange capacity of soils. Again, back in webinar 2, we talked about CEC essentially being the soil's capacity to hold on to cations. Now, what does that mean? I refer to the CEC as being your soil's battery. You know, the soil, or clay particularly, and organic matter in your soil possesses charge. So if you look at these clay platelets here, if you imagine that each of these clay platelets is negatively charged, so it's a negative, and it's a magnet with a negative pole, and essentially our cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, and hydrogen and aluminium as well, but they're usually in minor amounts, are all positively charged. And so when you've got a negative charge and a positive charge, these things can come together. Now, depending on the type of clay that you've got and how much organic matter is in the soil will determine how big your battery is, how much charge it actually possesses, and therefore how much inherent fertility it has, because it's really important for the retention of essential nutrients. But we also know that the proportion of the cations, the different types of cations that you've got attached to that charge in the clay will actually impact the structure and the way that those platelets actually arrange themselves, and whether they actually come together in stacks like you can see here, or once we get too much sodium in there, they actually start to repel each other. And so this is a bit of a target kind of range, if you like, in terms of the proportions of cations. We're usually looking for about 3/4 of the cations in soil to be calcium, and then the rest of it to be made up with magnesium next, 10 to 15%, and then potassium, and we want the smallest amount to be sodium. But what happens when we exceed the amount of sodium in the soil? So when we go from this kind of ratio in terms of our target cations, and we go to the situation where our exchangeable sodium percentage, as it's referred to, actually exceeds 6%. Back here, I've got it at 2%. Here, I think I've got it at 10%. What this actually does is it drives the dispersion of those clay particles. So instead of them all stacking together, they'll actually start to repel each other. And so that's when a soil is considered then sodic, when that proportion of the sodium exceeds 6% in comparison to the other cations. And so you can see here, here's an example of 3 different soils. These are actually 3 different depths of the same profile. So we've got the surface, and then we've got a sample from about 20 centimetres, and then this is the clay from deeper down. And so what we see, we've got all of this organic matter in the surface, and we've got all of these microbial glues and poos sticking this soil together. And so I've dropped that in water, and you can see a little bit of air which is escaping out of the pores, but this particular aggregate has stayed together. The next aggregate, we've put it in, and it's slaked, so the air's rushed into the pores and the pores have exploded, and so that soil has actually slumped, but it hasn't dispersed. Dispersion is the last image you can see, and so these are photos obviously from 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 10 minutes after I drop these aggregates into water, and you can see this cloudy halo starting to emerge and spread across the plate that I've got them in. So when this happens, the problem with that is that it causes waterlogging to occur, really, because the soil's pug. So when you get all of these little fine clay particles floating around in soil water, eventually the soil water will go down, and all of the air spaces basically in the soil get clogged up with this fine clay particles, and it causes waterlogging to occur, because then the water can't get through. There's no airspace, and so everything backs up and the whole lot can get pretty messy. So to diagnose sidicity, I've actually got a bit of an example here, which we can see. Essentially, what you'll need is some aggregates, about 5 to 7 millimetres in size, a jar, a dish, or a cup, and again, some clean water, either demineralised or rainwater. And you'll see, hopefully this will work for me. Everybody cross your fingers. Here we go. So this is an example of slaking. So just an aggregate dropped into water, and you saw how the aggregate itself actually fell apart, but it hasn't actually gone any further than that. And now this is actually a time lapse every few minutes. And we can see the aggregate on the right-hand side is really starting now to develop that little halo around the edge, get a little bit cloudy. And as we keep going through time, I think this might be a 30-minute time lapse in total. We can see that aggregate is really starting to completely disperse. And again, this is those clay platelets. Instead of them stacking together and holding together through the charges predominantly with the calcium, you've got too much sodium in there and they start to actually repel each other. And so here at the end of 30 minutes, we've got complete dispersion of the clay and all you can see is a few sand grains left. So thanks to the Victorian Department of Ag for that video. It's on their website if you're interested. That was meant to come back to my, of course it worked every other time. Skyly, is that back up now?
Yep, it's on the diagnosing. Yep.
Thank you.
Right.
So in the lab, of course, we would then get our cation exchange capacity measured, which is actually just the sum of all of the cations. So we'd send a sample to the lab. If you had dispersion that occurred in the paddock like this, or back in the shed or and on the kitchen bench, absolutely take a soil sample, send it to the lab, and they will measure the proportions of those cations that are in the soil, and then you can actually get that quantifiable number to tell you just how severe sedicity is, if it's playing a part in your particular farm. So nutrient fertility and biological cycling are one of the things that we really see being impacted, particularly on our alkaline soils, but also in our acidic clays as well. You can see this is an example of some beans from down towards Millicent. And this is really common. I'm quite sure that if you drove down there at the moment, you would see large swathes of bean and canola crops looking quite yellow. And we know that in these high pH soils, particularly, that nutrients can get locked up. So like I mentioned before about phosphorus, we know that, that iron and manganese will not be highly available to the crops as well when the soils are wet and waterlogged and alkaline. We also know that these soils can, because they tie up so much phosphorus, so indicated by a phosphorus buffering index test, that the combination of that and the fact that we have such high yield potential means that we actually have higher phosphorus requirements as well to grow our crops, 10 tonne plus, grain crops of wheat. So we have higher P requirements in this environment than what we see certainly across the rest of the state in the low to medium rainfall zone. We know that we can have challenges certainly with anaerobic conditions and the impact that then has on microbial activity, and also again the loss of nutrients. And the challenges of managing N, of course, these soils have got a lot of organic carbon in them, so they have the potential to mineralise a lot of nitrogen in crop. And we still haven't really got a handle on exactly how much happens in this environment in crop and how to properly measure that. But we're working on it. And then also about how we can tailor our N management to meet crop needs without any detrimental losses to the environment. So a few challenges there. To diagnose our constraints, in the paddock, again, soil colour, the presence of our ecosystem engineers, so, dung beetles, worms, ants, plants, either as indicator species or their root systems as well. The Fizz test is a really great one for seeing or confirming if you've got carbonate and bicarbonate through your soils, which again will drive the pH up, but will give you an indication of whether phosphorus is likely to get tied up when you apply it in soil. And so this is just an example of a Fizz test. If you've never heard of it before, essentially you make a solution of 10% hydrochloric acid mixed with water and drop that onto the soil, and essentially the acid, the hydrogen, will react with the carbonate and bicarbonate in the soil, and you'll see this little fizz that will develop there. At the bottom you can see all this little effervescence. The more strongly the soil effervesces tells you that how much carbonate you've got there. Don't be fooled just by the colour, because you can actually have a lot in the surface layers as well, and there's a little bit of effervescence just happening there. In this particular instance, that's actually just vinegar from the kitchen because I'd run out of acid. So if you've got soils that fizz like that, expect to have some issues with nutrient availability. So it's a really great cheap little test as well, just to see what's going on. Obviously at the lab, they're going to send you back always soil sample for nutrition in a 0 to 10 centimetre depth, and they're going to send back the results to detect deficiencies and toxicities. If you do have a soil like this, there's a new test for phosphorus. It's actually not that new anymore, but called the DGT, or the diffuse gradients and thin films test for phosphorus, which has been found to be really good at detecting the amount of phosphorus that's in the soil that might be available to the crop versus our standard kind of Cobble P or Bray or Olsen test. So request the DGT test for phosphorus as well. Again, this is the kind of analysis that you're going to get back from the lab, and it's going to tell you, whether how you're tracking and whether it's acceptable or not, from a nutrition perspective, organic carbon, pH, and also your trace elements as well. So really useful information there. And inundation, obviously you're going to be able to see inundation. In this particular case, this is from Bull Lagoon, and we can see some, when the shallow water tables come up and when you've got flowing surface waters, waterlogging is going to be pretty obvious at the surface. Usually in about August is when we peak at the worst. Obviously watching the levels in drains come up as well can tell you sort of how far down the water table is and when it's likely to reach the surface. You can possibly see some of this stuff from satellite as well. Bores and wellheels I found have been really interesting for tracking trends in groundwater levels across the region, because there's data there that goes back at least to the 70s in a lot of cases. And so here's an example just from the Water Connect website. If you haven't ever been there, it's just an SA Gov website, Water Connect, go to groundwater data. And it can be a bit tricky sometimes to find what you need. But so maybe, perhaps ring the landscape board if you need some help. I'm sure they've got someone who can point you in the right direction. But what you can see here, this is just a groundwater monitoring bore from down at Bowaka, so down near Kingston. And what we can see here, these measures are taken twice a year, usually in October and March. And you can see this sort of 6-month kind of oscillation in the groundwater where we get quite close to the surface and then we drop off in March and we come quite close again in October and we drop off. And so we can see sort of, we've been tracking along at about the same kind of levels for the last 10 years. But prior to that, during the sort of millennium drought, we really didn't come close to breaching the surface with groundwater levels down there through this sort of 2006, 7, 8, 9 period. And our groundwater levels in March after the summer, dropped to some of their lowest levels as well. So this kind of information can be really helpful if you're interested to see how much groundwater levels have changed for you over time. So to summarise all of that, if we have a look at, go back to our paddock that we had before, that we started with, and our zone 1 and our zone 2, we characterised there that our depth to rock in zone 1 was only, it's less than 30 centimetres, where we had sort of 50 centimetres of soil in zone 2. The pH was a bit higher in zone 1 and a bit lower in zone 2. The salinity in zone 1 was actually non-saline, so salts have been washed out just there, but we've got severe salinity down in this particular patch. This soil was dispersive and this soil was not. We had adequate nutrients across the whole paddock, and we had issues with waterlogging down here. Now, it turns out that topographically, this particular paddock, this is a low spot. These are actual low spots, and they've got deep soils, which is really common, and these are higher spots, and shallow soils over also hard rock, also quite common. And so we can know that salts can leach out of these areas, accumulate down here. We get the expression of acidity up here. And so the next question then is, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to treat these things? So treating all of our individual constraints. When it comes to treating shallow rock, there are, I guess, some emerging kind of practices that are becoming quite common now across the Limestone Coast in terms of either ripping rock to increase the root access down into lower layers of the profile, or shattering or munching or mulching as well with rock. This is an example. This is a what's called reefinator, which comes through and they describe it being like a cheese grater. And so if you can see here, this is actually, I've excavated the top 20 centimetres of soil, or 15 centimetres in soil in this particular case. So this is what the profile looks like underneath this particular area here. So we've got 10 to 15 centimetres of soil sitting over hard rock, which when we excavate the soil off the top, if I took all that back, this is what it looks like. And then after the reefinator has been through, what we see is that it actually grates off the top of that rock, and then the drum on the back crushes it all up. So we end up with this kind of finer rock, crushed rock through the profile. But actually, a lot of it actually stays quite deep. It doesn't actually, a lot of it come to the surface. You can see some areas of rock here which have come up. In this particular case, this has had a first pass at about 150 mils, and then a second pass at 300 to 400. So two passes here to sort of crack that surface to look like this. Now, what I will say though is that before you go embarking on any of these types of earthworks on your farms, that you be mindful of, you know, environmental and cultural and ecological impact of those things. You need to be aware that things like caves are protected as part of the Aboriginal Heritage Act. And so do be mindful of where you are in the landscape, and always pick up the phone to the Limestone Coast Landscape Board just to chat things through with them to make sure that you're good to go. Treating pH, you know, I discussed this in the last webinar about acidity. You know, lime it or lose it, and so you can head across to the Acid Soils SA website to learn all about lime applications and treating acidity and its causes. You'll see here's another alkaline soil profile. You know, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with a soil like this. I guess, you know, maintain as much cover as you can, you know, plant species that are going to be not as sensitive to high pH. You can use things like fluid phosphorus fertilizers that won't get tied up as much, and also things like ammonium sulfate based fertilizers, which can help to acidify the soil, and perhaps some gypsum, but we know that these soils have a high buffering capacity. So in a lot of ways, we've just got to learn to live with them. When it comes to treating salinity, like I said, we know that it occurs naturally in a lot of places unless you're irrigating and then you're actually putting salt in. So again, it's one of these things we kind of have to live with. So that, you know, involves planting salt tolerant species, enhancing our drainage and making sure we can leach salts, particularly if you've been irrigating and you've got a bit of a salt load that's come into the soil. You can have a leaching irrigation event ahead of a rainfall event to try and push those salts through the profile. But be warned, there is a relationship between salinity and acidicity. So what you can see in this particular image is that a soil, which is saline, in this case, we've got increasing salinity on the y-axis and increasing acidicity or exchangeable sodium percentage on the x-axis. When this EC, of the salinity of the soil, is high, it actually causes those clay particles to come back together, and you'll notice this in sort of salty waters, salty dams or salty drains, that they'll be very clear, and that's because the clay particles themselves are forced back together because you've got a high electrolyte concentration in the water, and then they cause flocks and they'll settle out. So commonly a saline soil will actually be very stable. However, when you wash the chloride out and you leave the sodium behind, you remember, what does the sodium do? It makes it disperse. And so, you know, these are the same soil samples from the same place. And in this particular case, it's in a dish of saline solution. And so you'll see that particle was completely held together. The aggregate hasn't broken down at all. And in this case, it's in fresh water, and you'll see that that dispersion has occurred. So there is a relationship here, and you need to be mindful of it, because if you're going to go, you know, treating your salinity, you also need to treat your acidicity as well, or your soils can disperse and become quite boggy and you're going to lose productivity anyway. So really, to treat acidicity, it's all about replacing sodium with calcium. And in an alkaline or neutral soil, we do that with gypsum. And in an acidic soil, you really want to use lime. So remember, the idea here is to try and get this blue bit, you know, back to over here, our sort of target proportions of cations. And actually, here's a new technology or emerging technology, which is increasingly being adopted across the country, which is variable rate gypsum application. This particular example is from Delta Agribusiness in New South Wales. And this is a chickpea crop, which is growing at the moment. This year, they mapped the soil earlier in the year and worked out just how extreme the acidicity was. And you can see the amount of variability. You know, this is the gypsum application rate. And, you know, in large swathes of the paddock, we don't need any. And then we've got 2.5 tonnes, 4 tonnes, up to 6 tonnes of gypsum that was required in this particular paddock. And so here's an example of how these chickies are growing at the moment in the 6 tonnes of gypsum versus no gypsum. So you can see the soil surface here is quite crusted, it's dispersed, and obviously this crop has struggled to germinate. So that's the kind of impact you can have just in the first season when you treat acidicity with gypsum. When it comes to nutrient deficiencies, obviously we want to correct for these by applying and incorporating specific nutrient packages based on your soil test results. But I guess we can consider some alternative formulations as well. So we know that things like fluid phosphorus fertilizer is more effective on alkaline soils. So these are things like ammonium polyphosphate, which are actually quite acidic. You could try chelated trace elements, which can keep the nutrients in a protected form so that the plant can take them up before the soil does. And things like ammonium N-based fertilizers, which can, like I said, help to acidify the soil if you're in an alkaline environment, but you obviously don't want to use them on an acidic soil. But I think the other thing we can really do is try and stimulate both biological activity and restore our physical fertility by using more diverse crop types, growing polycultures rather than monocultures, and different times of the year as well. So this is an example of some of the plants that I pulled up from my cover crop that was growing actually up near Yamali back in March. So, you know, we hadn't had much rainfall up there over the summer, but, you know, you've got an example here of sorghum, millet, tillage radish and a forage brassica, and have a look at the different root systems and architecture that are getting down and doing great things in the soil that, you know, you wouldn't get if you were just growing a wheat crop with its roots going straight down. Treating inundation, obviously, you know we have this massive network of artificial drains throughout the region. There are things that you can do on your own farm to enhance shallow drainage and you know, get water flowing better. So some new technologies in terms of topographical mapping, which you can collect with a drone or with a ground-mounted unit to show you where the high spots and the low spots and where water would naturally flow. So there's some of those technologies you can seek advice on in terms of how to optimize drainage across your farms. Treating sedicity, like I said, is really important for waterlogging. You need to open that soil up. We need to get some air back in there. You need to get some aggregation and actually let water flow back through soils rather than it being waterlogged. Encouraging those deep rooted perennials to actually extract as much moisture from soils as we possibly can and convert it into feed. And of course, deep cultivation and rock fracture as well might actually help to you know, improve water movement through our soils and landscape as well. So in this particular case, what would I do? Well, up in zone 1, I think that rock breaking in this particular case in that sort of 30 to 40 centimetre layer would be worthwhile. You know, you wouldn't worry about it down here because you know that the rock is deeper than that anyhow, but you'd probably still drive across it. There's no point turning around. Up here, we really need a gypsum application in zone 1 to treat the sedicity and this dispersion that is occurring in the bogginess and the hard setting. And down in zone 2, you know, certainly optimizing the drainage down through there would be beneficial. But of course, once you've done that and you've washed the chloride out, you need to put some gypsum back in there too, or you're then going to get the expression of sedicity. So, you know, all of those different sort of chemical and physical type measures that we've just looked at can help you to make really good decisions and not sort of to target your investment, I guess, you know, in the zones that actually need it. So my take-home messages are actually the same as the ones for the Sandy Soils webinar, which, you know, clay soils, both in the surface layers and the subsoils, can contain multiple constraints that can, you know, result in poor crop water use. And just because your neighbour used one particular strategy to overcome theirs and it worked, doesn't mean it's going to work at your place, because you might have a different range of constraints. So we know that productivity and resilience and profitability can be improved when you treat constraints, but it's so important that you diagnose them properly, the type of constraints you've got, the depth of them in the profile, where they occur and how severe they are, so that you make sure you're going to get the best bang for your buck when you do put, you know, a machine or an implement or an amendment in the paddock. And, you know, our healthy soils provide the most amazing vital services to nature and humanity. And, you know, again, please go and love them and nurture them and observe them and be with them. And, yeah, hopefully you can see and feel the energy that they possess and the impact that that has. My acknowledgements for today. The numbers that you saw today have all come from Interpreting Soil Test Results. It's a really great book to get your hands on from CSIRO. It's easily found if you do a Google search on that one. The Soil Quality website has lots of great fact sheets for different states and different chemical, physical and biological properties. So I recommend you head over there if you want to know more about any of the things I talked about today. Of course, our grower community and the host farmers who kindly let me come and work with them and take photos and share their information like I've done with you today. Thank you wholeheartedly to all of them. Of course, the McKillop Farm Management Group, the Limestone Coast Landscape Board and the National Landcare Program have actually funded a lot of the case studies that I discussed with you today have actually come through funding from those organisations. So thank you. That brings us to the end of our 5 series webinars. I'd like to thank my colleague Amanda Chappell, who I think is online still, who presented in webinar 3, and also my dear colleague Claire Dennerley, who helped me in webinar 1. I hope you've enjoyed the series as much as we have,